Waterford as the editor-at-large at the Canberra Times. He graduated from the ANU in 1972. Sorry, he graduated from the ANU having studied law, and he became a cadet at the Canberra Times in 1972. Just a little too late for the referendum and the freedom rides as well, but you would have been on that bus, I bet. You would have been there had you been at university at the time, also in New South Wales probably. In 2007, Jack was named Canberra Citizen of the Year, which is great. And he has also won an award for his work with journalism and also advocating for Indigenous affairs. Please make him welcome. This is Jack Waterford.
For a man who's tall, tall in his career, and tall otherwise as well.
Darling, I appreciated your question, the first thing about the Aboriginal referendum. I come from a part of Australia where people voted no in that referendum. I come from rural northwestern New South Wales, and the nearest town to which I grew up was a town called Walgett, which was one of the first centrepiece parts of the 1964 freedom ride. And I have to say, with a sense of shame that I had then, as much as now, that it was a school friend of mine, who was an older school friend of mine, who was the person who drove straight at the freedom bus and forced it off the road so that it turned over. And this was a fairly ordinary incident of my life. And in talking to you today about Aboriginal affairs, I suppose I want to start from a bit of the perspective of the country kid who grew up, as I did, amongst Aboriginal people, who was taught to read and write by an Aboriginal woman, and whose father perhaps was a bit of a ratbag who paid equal wages to Aborigines from the big time that he owned a sheep station in the late 1940s, and who was an advocate for Aboriginal affairs, and was on that account not particularly popular in the district from which he came. In 1959 he virtually started race riots in Canberra in western New South Wales by the things that he did to try to allow Aborigines to be allowed to live in the town. The Sydney Morning Herald, which was not, I might say, a great champion of Aborigines, but which was deeply against the Labor Party, which was represented at Canberra by a fellow called Jack Renshaw, soon to be Premier, thought they could use this to shame the folk of Canberra and declared that Canberra was Australia's little rock. Now, when I go on to talk briefly about some of the conditions, I want you to understand one thing right from the start. When many of us think about Aborigines, we think about people living out in remote Northern Territory and so forth. Sometimes we think of people who live as fringe dwellers on the edges of these country towns I was like to describe. In fact, Aboriginal Australians live overwhelmingly in the cities of Australia and in the regional cities of Australia, the Dubbos, the Woggers, and places like that, rather than in some of the sort of localities from which I came from. But I think particularly, if you like, of country towns, of towns such as Burke and Moree and Walgett and Brewarrina, and the one that I especially relate to, Gadooga, when I'm sort of talking. And what was apparent in those days in particular was that Aborigines were a sort of a shadow on the horizon that most people didn't think about. In those places, as well as in Australia these days, people could say, and often did, I don't know any Aboriginal people. I've never had an Aboriginal family in my house. But you could live in Walgett, where there were only 3,000 people, of whom 900 were Aboriginal. And still people would say much the same thing. Around Burke and around Gadooga, Aboriginal people in those days, I don't think they would at all now, but self-described themselves as the dark people. And in a sort of a way, they were sort of a shadow over our environment. They moved in the same space as we did. They lived in our houses as often as not because they were doing manual work, etc. But they weren't part of the ordinary intercourse of the community. They had no place whatsoever on Main Street, and in many places there were informal segregation or apartheid sort of systems that got them well off the main street at dark. They never figured in people's discussion about what was going to happen in the place. It's one of the things that happens to me now as a retired and venerable old newspaper editor. I get called upon to judge competitions. And one of the competitions I get called on to judge is for country newspaper editorials. And call me perverse or whatnot, but when I read these editorials, which might be about road safety or whatever, but the question I sort of mentally ask myself every time is, who do they think they're talking to? Who is the us in this discussion? When they talk about how, there's a problem of vandalism, do they think that the vandals are their own children in the community? Or do they think that they're strange aliens in it? Well, when you want to talk about the them and the us, the strongest question you've always got to ask is, are Aborigines part of the us or are they part of the them? Now, in all the time that I've lived, and I suspect for 100 years after I die, Aborigine is going to be the main problem in Australia. Right? When we think about them or talk about them, if we do, they are the most visibly disadvantaged on almost any index that you think, whether it's health or education or welfare or unemployment or anything like that. That discrimination is much helped, if you like, by the visible signs of difference, but increasingly it's happening even in our cities or wherever, that Aborigines are still not part of the us, but are discernibly different. And they're a problem. Because they're the them, we have to do something about them. And mostly what we want to do things about them is things to them rather than with them or for them. And one of the main problems why is that Aborigines, it's not so much that they're different, but they don't live in exactly the same way that we do. They have different patterns of relationship and family and environment and whatnot, which means that they do not fit easily into the solutions that we, as middle-class Australians, and most of us these days live in a middle-class sort of way, but which we take for granted. So we've organised separate legal services, medical services and other welfare services to cope with some of these aspects of difference. But even now we still have major problems of what you might call the fit, and whether or not Aboriginal Australians are going to walk with the same dignity in their own country, their own country, as Australians of all sorts of backgrounds, whether people like myself who have, I'm a 7th generation Australian, or whether people who've come into our society in a welcome way only relatively recently. But at the moment, there's not just a problem of the fit. There's a problem of the trust. And I don't mean Aboriginal trust in white institutions, though let me tell you, that doesn't run very high. It's white trust of Aboriginal Australians. The grants that are issued, whether by Commonwealth governments or state and federal governments, don't trust Aborigines to spend it themselves or to decide what they do. We're spending about $3 on firms of accountants certifying that $1 is spent correctly. Right at the moment, as a public welfare problem, Commonwealth state governments are spending $250,000 per annum per Aboriginal family. Yet the income of that typical Aboriginal family is about $30,000. That's to say we're spending about $8 or $9 on white folk, essentially, who are in the industry of looking after and telling black folk what to do. These are people who work at Centrelink, they're people who work in mainstream health institutions, they're the cops, and so forth like that. But they're focused on services that are going at Aborigines, and they're subdivided about that way. Every 40 years ago, writing an article about Aboriginal health for Fred Hollow's trachoma problem, I remarked that by now we've reached the point where in the medical literature, the professional medical literature, we had one report describing aspects of Aboriginal ill health per Aboriginal family. Now we have at least one report per Aboriginal person. The only reality that hasn't changed is the situation of health. What Peter Moody once described as a ward full of diseases in the one person. Every year, just at federal government level, there are 10 reports handed down. These are amongst 500 other reports on Aboriginal affairs, but which purport to record how things are changing in Aboriginal affairs. There's the Bringing Them Home report, there's the Stolen Children report, there's the Closing the Gap report and whatnot. And each of them every year gets glossier and glossier and thicker, recycling the same old statistics. The Productivity Commission reckons that the statistics in them are much the same anyway. That's when they're not completely made up. But what's happening is that we're describing what's happening. I'm describing what's happening, but we're not really doing anything very much about it. We've got all these modern things. Waterford's Law of Aboriginal Affairs, which I've promulgated and, I must say, got a trademark about it, but basically says that every new minister is worse than the last one. I have known every minister for Aboriginal Affairs since the first one, every single one of them. The absolute worst, and it's not for want of goodwill to Aborigines, but was Jenny Macklin. She absolutely represented the, I wouldn't say paternalistic, but in her case I'll say paternalistic, we know best syndrome. She always knew better. She always had an anecdote which cancelled out all of the evidence. She, with a great public policy background, and she has got one, and a really keen interest in Aboriginal uplifting and various things like that, but and perpetual use of the word evidence-based, never read a piece of evidence if she disagreed with the conclusion about it. Now, I'm not advocating this council of despair. I hope to live for a day when things are better. I say to you that only Aboriginal people can liberate themselves. We can't do it. We can't actually pass a law overnight which is going to say that Aborigines are going to be absolutely fabulous. The most we can do is help and provide the mechanisms for do so against a long background, not just of suspicion, distrust, and what I would call a very healthy level of, what's the word for it, passive resistance. If you've lived all your life in this dosage of other people knowing best for you, you tend to more or less go along sullenly with what you're told, but not sort of invest anything very much in things very much changing. Now, it has happened in Australia before. Everything I described about Aborigines just then and their woeful condition in Australian society, you could have said 100 years ago about Irish Catholics. You could read the English literature of the English middle class despairing of the fecklessness and hopelessness and worthlessness of the English Cockney, scum of the earth class, the sort of people we transported to Australia in the first place. We've seen, and I think of people in this room about this, but all sorts of people being announced or denounced as people who cannot and will never fit in. The Vietnamese, when they came. You remember they were all involved in little cliques living in places like Cabramatta and all sort of involved in the drug trade and various things like that. Now they're our model of industrious Australians. We're worried about whether Muslim people can fit in. We worried before about whether Greeks could fit in. Apologies, Nick. We worried whether the Italians could fit in. Right? Australia is a great melting pot society, but I'll just sort of finish off here. our first Australians, our original Australians. We've got to find a place for them too. And it's probably got to be a special place, but right at the moment, I'd be just content if it was an equal place.
Jack Waterford. Oh, I love a speech where you start naming and shaming the worst ministers. Whilst also having one of them in the room. But we're talking federal level, of course I need to... federal level.